Hi, everyone. We're going to go over one big section and one medium section of the DSM. I combine these because we'll see that there are different disorders that can really flow into the comorbidity conceptualization within neurodevelopmental disorders and disruptive impulse control and conduct disorders. And then the other reason that we have all of these disorders combined is because of the fact that, oh, where's my agenda? Is because of the fact that ADHD really can be the connective bridge or the connective tissue between one section and the other. Another reason is because these disorders are really focused on diagnosing children, adolescents. Certainly they can go into adulthood, especially when we talk about, well, there's lots of disorders that can fit into that conceptualization, but this is where we're focusing on disorders that are emerged or that emerge and that can start to be diagnosed in children and adolescents. And so that's really like the kid focus component of this course. Know that this is not necessarily my degree of specialty, especially the neurodevelopmental section with regard to intellectual developmental disorder and a lot of the communication specific learning and motor disorders. And so part of that is why we don't cover it so much and why I don't really focus on it for the exam. But the other part of it is just this is a lot of information, and I really want to make sure that we that we speak to the key components of diagnoses that are going to be the most valuable for you to know moving forward into the start of your clinical experience. And so I will note when we get to disorders that are really just opportunities for further study rather than disorders that we're going to spend more time on. But I do know ADHD very well, and I do know the disruptive impulse control and conduct disorder diagnoses really well, having worked with adolescents in the adolescent system of when I worked for the county and I worked with probation, a lot of these disorders were very present. So I'll speak to that too. But just know that with all these disorders, the ones in red are the ones that we're going to be more so focusing on and are going to be on the exam. The ones in black are not going to be on the exam. Know that what's different about these disorders in general, again, specifically our neurodevelopmental disorders, is that in comparison to the diagnoses that we've talked about to date, these diagnoses really do require comprehensive psych testing, comprehensive measures in order to make a diagnosis because of the fact that we're talking about developmental brain processes that certainly show up as far as impairments in terms of personal, social, academic, adaptive, cognitive functioning. Like it's not just we have a major depressive episode for a couple weeks or a couple months, and then, you know, once we get back to baseline, we don't have any sort of notable impairments. A lot of these disorders are so global, and so it's less about doing a quick assessment and more about wanting to make sure that we get a really comprehensive understanding of the different dimensions that might be impaired if a person has meets criteria for these diagnoses. So we take it really seriously is the point. Okay. Know, as I said, that this is really just an introduction, that you can come back to these slides, come back to this video for later on in your clinical work. I think that's really the case for all of the chapters that we've covered, but the slides specifically, you can come back to those depending on what type of population you're working with. For the sake of learning, we need to recognize that there is such variance in terms of person to person with these diagnoses, with how these diagnoses show up. This really especially pertains to autism spectrum disorder, that there, in the DSM, it talks about just the nuances of individuality, and especially as we can identify that there are comorbidities within these diagnoses in these chapters, and there are other comorbidities as far as overlapping mental disorders. And so it's going to look very differently from person to person to person. And so we need to take that into consideration. Also, for the sake of learning, we need to stick to the DSM and stick to direct references within your learning. So I've found so many, I think just throughout the course, I always hear different, we've talked about this in class, but just different disorders that are not actual disorders that come up that are on the internet. But I've found this on the internet of just the different types of ADHD, Ring of Fire ADHD. That's such a fascinating title, but this is not real. There's no clinical evidence that speaks to this. This is, I don't know, this is somebody's conceptualization, but just remember that I'm a purist for a good reason, because we don't want to overly complicate things, but just stick to what we are learning in these chapters and what's on the slides. Also, disclaimer, the category of neurodevelopmental disorders really demonstrates that these symptoms sit on spectrums of severity. So we have lots of different opportunities for severities to be able to apply to a person's presentation or a child's presentation, and that specifically can speak to what we see on the autism spectrum as well. And just so there's different levels of impairments. I know that the word deficit is used a lot, but it's used because what we are trying to do is to identify that there is a baseline for normal developmental milestones that are not reached. And we are recognizing deficits in reaching those milestones in order to actually come closer to making a diagnosis. So this is where, it's identifying we're deliberately using this language for the sake of better understanding what these symptoms look like in especially this first chapter, but know that we still want to look at the whole person, right? And I know I don't have to say this for the sake of just recognizing I'm using this word that can be really stigmatizing, but this is where we also get to remember to zoom out as much as we can when we're talking about treatment and clinical practice in general. There's a difference between assessment and the clinical practice. Also, along those lines, typical. This is a subjective concept that we need to consider that's based on our societal norms. A lot of the diagnoses in the neurodevelopmental chapter talk about this, that like these diagnoses are made based on a child, adolescent's failure to actually meet these typical milestones. But that is still really subjective because we're comparing it to a set of other kids within a particular population and using standard deviations, or, well, this is where I'm not a psychologist, so I can't speak to the updated nuances of what psych testing looks like, but I'm pretty sure it's still standard deviations. We're still using numbers to be able to help compare. And so this is where typical is like, we just identify that we have understanding of what's normal and understanding of what's not normal. Therefore, that helps us to be able to clarify how a child or adolescent is struggling. And as I mentioned, neurodevelopmental disorders are super, super highly comorbid with one another. Examples of this are just with regard to intellectuals on the spectrum. They can have intellectual developmental disorders, or in other words, an intellectual disability. Children with ADHD, there's so much comorbidity with ADHD in general, but the textbooks talks about how that can be comorbid with specific learning disorders. And we see that that neurodevelopmental disorders can be overlapping with regard to communication disorders, with depression, anxiety. There's just a lot of overlap, and it's maybe a chicken or the egg thing. I think other notable partnerships are like ADHD with ODD, tics with obsessive compulsive disorder, communication disorders with autism spectrum disorder, that can be intertwined with anxiety disorders. So there's just a lot of overlap, and the brain works in interesting ways as far as compensation or decompensation. And so that's where we again get to zoom out and identify if, hey, I'm meeting with this kiddo, I'm meeting with this adolescent, or I'm meeting with this adult who has this historical diagnosis. How does the more notable diagnosis that I'm seeing as far as an anxiety disorder fit with that? Again, it might be conceptually, how does this conceptually fit with that? But these are the things that we're asking ourselves. So I'm going to start with intellectual developmental disorder. I'm going to call it intellectual disability. This is the shorter, easier way to be able to say this, so we have room to be able to use either or both. But this is the newer diagnosis that took place in mental retardation. So historically, for a long time, we called it mental retardation. We have a much more fancy, nuanced title now, intellectual disability. And so this is a disorder that we take very seriously as far as diagnosis, as far as how we look at the overall degree of impairment for the child, in some cases the adolescent, if that person has not been able to be tested until adolescence. But usually when kids go into school, this is where we start to see markers that they are failing to meet particular milestones developmentally, intellectually, as far as just their overall autonomy. And so that's why, for the most part, I would say, like in our culture, in our country, kids have the opportunity to be able to, and this is why I say for the most part, kids have the opportunity and the resources for testing, because that's when other people start to see that there are impairments in these areas of functioning. So in order to meet criteria, there has to be some sort of impairment that these symptoms show up during the developmental period, where we would see kids continuously growing, learning, adapting to their environment, being able to be more flexible, making changes, using more critical thinking. But when children are not able to do that, that's what indicates to us that there are issues as far as their adaptability or developmental and neurological functioning. So we're going to see deficits in intellectual functioning, such as reasoning, problem solving, planning, abstract thinking. I know I'm reading this, but still, abstract thinking, judgment, academic learning, learning from experience. This needs to be confirmed by both clinical assessment and individualized standardized intelligence testing. So how do kids do as far as developmentally normalized, normative standardized testing? And then how do they do in terms of speaking with somebody that's assessing with them, and engaging in social connection and being able to have an age appropriate conversation? Like, what does that actually look like? So this is where I go back to this idea that this is we need to, in order to make these diagnoses, we need super comprehensive testing in order to do that. So there are going to be issues with intellectual functioning, and there are going to be issues as far as adaptive functioning. And because of the fact that there are deficits in adaptive functioning, this results in failure to meet developmental socio-cultural standards for behaviors and markers such as personal independence and social responsibility. So can a kid who is 6 tie their shoes? Can they put their clothes on? Can they brush their teeth? Do they have the ability to recognize sequencing in order to do that? Do they have a sense of awareness about, if I am, at 8 years old, if I don't shower, maybe I think that's age appropriate, but we'll just say 8, 10, 12, right? If I don't shower and I'm stinky, then people around me are going to notice that, or I notice that other people regularly bathe, that they don't show up with dirt on their faces or their bodies. And so I need to recognize that and make sure that I'm taking a bath, even if I don't want to. Like, just having that awareness, or what we call the theory of mind, to be able to identify what are the kids around me doing, and am I doing that or not? Do these kids that we're assessing in this way actually have that type of thinking capability, that type of awareness? If there are deficits, then without ongoing support, these adaptive deficits are going to limit functioning in one or more areas or activities of daily living. So when we talk about ADLs, if there are difficulties meeting standards for independence, social responsibility, we're going to see difficulties as far as communication, social participation, independent living, being able to function across multiple environments such as home, school, work, or community. It's not one context, it's going to be multiple, if not all contexts, that we're going to see some sort of adaptive deficit. And again, the onset of these deficits is going to show up during the developmental period for the child. I realized that I had planned to use my microphone, so I had to switch. So overall, the overview for this disorder, for this diagnosis, is that it has to be characterized by deficits in general mental, intellectual functioning or abilities. What was talked about in criterion A, and I have a slide to show after this. And as a result of these deficits, so we have neurological impairments, right? Thinking impairments that are actually impacted by what's happening in the brain. As a result of these deficits, there are impairments in terms of one's adaptive functioning. And that's further broken down into the areas of conceptual, so academic functioning, social, and practical domains. And so I'm going to talk about this in the next slide. But the note on this diagnosis identifies that we can use either term, so intellectual developmental disorder or intellectual disability, and we have different severities that we can look to as far as homing in on a particular snapshot of a person's functioning. So mild, moderate, severe, or profound. I'm not going to go over the whole depth of that. I have something I'll talk about in class, but we have these 4 categories. Again, note that IQ is no longer used as a metric to categorize severities, because that's what it used to be. With mental retardation, it used to be that we would have these 4 categories that were essentially defined by IQ range. And so now that's helpful in being able to speak to a child's functioning in one degree, but this is not the end all be all. So this is where intellectual functioning can be living in the brain. We can see this in the frontal lobe with regard to reasoning, problem solving, planning, judgment. So important. And again, we know that that does not get fully developed for anybody until the age of 25, but that is still failing to meet the age related milestones for development, depending on when the person is assessed. Frontal lobe, this is where we're going to see impairments in terms of language, working memory, just practical understanding. It could live in the motor cortex as far as movement. Parietal lobe, we see difficulties as far as perceptual reasoning. This is like the fancy part of the brain, as far as critical thinking, abstract thought, being able to just even function with regard to spelling. So overall, what the literature says is that, again, we can still keep IQ as a metric, but usually when we see a person's development below 2 standard deviations through standard and updated psychological testing, that's what can demonstrate these impairments, along with clinical assessment, along with other batteries, to be able to really give a comprehensive and confirmed clinically significant outcome to show and confirm, pardon me, what I'm trying to say is confirm these impairments. So this is what we mean when we say adaptive functioning. This is the broader version in criterion B. Adaptive functioning is how well a person actually meets community standards of personal independence and social responsibility in comparison to others of similar age, sociocultural background. And it's in these 3 domains. So when you hear conceptual, think about this academic. So competence in memory, language, reading, math, writing, acquisition of practical knowledge, like how well a person can actually learn, how well they can problem solve, what their judgment is in new situations. And memory, I think, is so important to go first here, because can you remember what you learned? And can you use that? And it's continuously a progressive and adaptive experience that a child, teenager, adult has.
And so that's where we're going to see this show up, especially in an academic setting, because that's what the progression of an academic experience expects and entails. Socially, I mean, this can go into what we see as a deficit in the autism spectrum, but does a person actually have awareness of others' thoughts, feelings, experiences? Do they have the capacity for empathy, the demonstration of empathy? Practically, this is what, when we talk about activities of daily living, learning self-management across multiple settings in life. So personal care, responsibilities, money management, play, self-management of behavior, organization, being able, so like can a child function in areas of autonomy, of getting ready for the day, of being able to navigate walking to the bus, of being able to actually remember the different steps that go into this. And I know I'm talking about memory, but can they actually, is there executive functioning that is within normal range or not? When a person gets older, then this is where we're going to see these deficits show up in terms of work, in terms of just life management. So, again, can a person sequence in order to be able to wake up in the morning on time, get dressed, get ready, navigate transportation, get to work, function at work, have appropriate interactions with people? Can they manage their finances? Are they able to really operate independently relative to their chronological age? So, let's see. I'm at the bottom of the slide. What I want to say is, oh, I'm sorry, pardon me, backing up. We need a deficit in one or more of these domains in order to actually meet criteria for criterion B, in order to meet the standard for criterion B. Going to the bottom of the slide, so I've talked about like we want to make sure that a person is given comprehensive, individualized, culturally appropriate, and standardized testing, meaning that these tests are not outdated, and that whomever's conducting the test is competent to be able to do this, that um, people are well trained, that like so we can ensure as clear of information and results as possible. But what the DSM says is that in the event that being able to complete comprehensive examinations difficult or impossible, then this is where we could identify that the child might be diagnosed with unspecified intellectual developmental disability, um, until comprehensive testing can be reached. So that's where I'm on this slide. So children over 5 that don't actually meet developmental milestones, but just can't be formally tested. This is where we can give them that diagnosis. But children under the age of 5 that are not meeting developmental milestones, but just can't be formally assessed because of age or other barriers, this is where they'll have the diagnosis of global developmental delay. Um, so this is a super comprehensive snapshot of the severities grid, but know that we have a much more thorough set of information in the DSM starting on page 39. But what we would, if a child was presenting with mild conceptual academic deficits, then they might have some learning disabilities. They might require some support. The further along the spectrum we get, it might be that they really need increasingly more support with academic skills, or that there's a limited understanding of language, of being able to really um, uh, remember, to have working memory, to be able to apply basic math skills, to a profound, like they really cannot understand basic academic areas of functioning. Socially, it might, again, there's a range from some pardon me, some difficulties in navigating social situations to really limited skills or limited communication skills, being able to actually identify appropriate language to use. So I'm looking under severe, that might be limited communication skills socially with single words and phrases, inability to be able to perceive, interpret social cues, gestures, might not be able to participate in social activities, um, rudimentary skills in that regard, and then practical skills, so the activities of daily living. There might be some sort of need for support or redirection, all the way to this child or this adolescent or this adult really is not going to be able to navigate the daily needs of their life without some significant support. So I know I'm really skimming over this, but just recognize again, we have spectrums for a reason. We have just degrees of severities for a reason. The other thing I was going to say was, oh, yeah. Oh, no, I'm thinking of autism spectrum disorder. Um, okay, so autism spectrum disorder, this is where same, but we're not even same, but different. But this I'm moving this disorder up because it segues better from intellectual developmental disorders. So we're going to see two main issues with autism spectrum disorder. First of all, we are going to see deficits in social communication, social reciprocity across multiple contexts. Wait, I got to pull this up in the book. Hence where you can hear my pages moving. So, and we're going to see restricted repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activity. So that's the two things, is that someone that has this diagnosis is going to have difficulty managing their social relationships because of a limited understanding, a limited interest, a limited ability to be able to engage in culturally appropriate social communication, social relationships. And we're going to see that they really have a fixed interest repetitively, but it's restricted. Their fixed interests restricted, um, that shows up in terms of their behavior. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. But with regard to criterion A, this is going to happen across the context of their life, across the times of their life. It's going to look different depending on the age of the individual. But and for anybody that knows someone that's on the spectrum, or as we used to diagnose with Asperger's, um, we would see deficits in terms of how a person shows up socially. So it might be that there's limited back and forth engagement, like a limited curiosity of question asking, of, hey, how are you doing? It's more of like a report out as far as communication. But I'm looking at criterion A1, that reduced sharing of interests or emotions, like not really looking to other people to be able to share and same similar experiences. And this is like what we see earlier on in children, is that that lack of pointing, the lack of like, look over here, or like, look, mom, look what I did. This is where there's going to be a deficit in that type of behavior. Also, deficits in terms of nonverbal communication. So, I use pointing as an example, but what we would classically see is difficulties or that disconnect in terms of eye contact, in terms of like mirroring of body language, mirroring of eye contact. So, this is where, in comparison to somebody, when I'm actively listening, if I'm actively listening, I'm going to be looking at you, I'm going to be nodding my head, I'm going to be like engaged with my body. If I was on the spectrum, then I might not be paying, well, I might not be paying attention because it doesn't matter to me. Or if I am listening, I'm not looking at you. I am shifted away, but I'm not having awareness of how that's affecting you. That's really what that component of comes down to, is like, where I might be very flat in my facial expressions. I'm just receiving the information, but I'm not actually reflecting back socially, emotionally, that reciprocity of, oh, I get what you're saying. And or I'm registering that this is sad information that you're sharing. And I can imagine that it's sad, that the disconnect is an incongruent type of demonstration of this. Furthermore, deficits in terms of developing, maintaining, understanding relationships, that can be different depending on who the person is. But this is where we look at flexibility. Can a person be flexible and adaptable in different situations? I've had clients that are on the spectrum and have had awareness of like, oh, nobody else likes talking about. I had one client that was like, why doesn't this is during the heyday of vampire fiction? Like, why doesn't anybody want to talk to me about Twilight for 6 hours on the bus on the way home? And my client was like genuinely perplexed of like, I wanted just to talk all about, I've never read the books admittedly, but like, I wanted to talk about all about, I guess, Team Jacob and why Team Jacob is better than Team Edward. Okay, I remembered enough. Um, and my client was like, why this, I was talking to this girl and she started looking away and she wasn't interested. And why was that? And so it was like, well, did you ask her questions? Well, no, because I thought this was really important and I wanted to talk to her about this so that she could really be just as excited as I am. Like, well, we have to have a back and forth process. And I had to teach my client that it was like our emotions and our communication and our relationships like a game of tennis. Like it's got to go back and forth. You have to continue to really volley the ball. Otherwise, if I just keep lobbing balls over the court, somebody's not going to want to play with me. That person was like, oh, well, I still really want to talk about Twilight. Okay, so I had to have very slow, realistic expectations. Now, with restricted, repetitive patterns of behaviors, interests, activities, we need to see two or more of the following. Oh, pardon me. For the first area, we have to see all of the following issues as far as deficits in social communication, social emotional reciprocity. But pardon me, but for criterion B, we need to see at least two examples. So it might be that, and we see this more within children. It's going to change as a person develops into adolescence into an adult. And often we don't see these types of like stereotyped motor movements like hand flapping, like lining things up, flipping them, repeating echolalia is like repeating words over and over and over again, or repeating phrases over and over again, that this is known to really be more so masked in public situations, and especially as because it doesn't mean that there's an absence of awareness and development, but it's just markedly different than what's expected of a person's age. And so this is where masking comes into play. Sorry, I'm being tangential, but this is where masking comes into play of it doesn't necessarily show up in the same way publicly that we do see these behaviors at home, for example. With insistence on sameness, like an inflexible adherence to um, really following through with rules, with timing, with schedules, with patterns. So for kids, what we would see is like if a child is not actually, if they are so used to the need to have dinner and then we clean up after dinner and then right after dinner we take a bath, if that child's parents are like, hey, we're actually gonna, after dinner, we're gonna have dessert and then we're gonna go to the park to go see your friends, that child might have a high degree of distress because it's like, no, it's not the same. I'm supposed to take a bath after this. I'm not supposed to go see anybody in a park. And so there's a lot of rigidity in that thinking process and a difficulty in demonstrating psychological flexibility to change the process. And so, a lot of parents really struggle with this because it goes back and forth of like what they're supposed to, we have to pivot. They don't always get to be in control. And I think what it comes down to for parents is recognizing, hey, you cannot use logic to try to help them to understand that in all cases, you cannot just totally use logic and out logic them. And so we have to find some sort of middle ground of understanding if I'm going to do something to mess up the routine, my child, my teenager is going to get very distressed about this. Even just like, eating the same food every day at the same time. Like there's just a lot of repetitive patterns that can come out with this disorder in this particular way. Highly restricted, fixated interests. This is what we call perseveration. So this is like the child that knows everything about trains, that knows everything about, I think in my next slide, I have one on, yeah, this in the box on the right hand side of the slide, number 3. This is, I had a friend whose son was so obsessed with pirates and he wanted a pirate bed and his whole room looked like this AI version. And that's all he wanted to talk about with all the history of these particular pirates. I can't remember all the specifics, but um, just so excited about that. And again, kids can do this. This is what we can see. Like this is not an uncommon thing, but we're going to see the clustered symptoms around this too. So um, that's where we go back to what else is restricted or repetitive as far as interest, behaviors, inflexibility, etc. Um, and Lastly, an option would be hyper or hyporeactivity to sensory input or output. And so whether that's like, really having difficulties with touch, with temperature, with sounds, with taste, textures. I'm saying things that I'm sure all of us know to some degree, but this is what we even smells like there just is a different type of connection. Um, that each person that has this disorder would experience. I go back to that statement of if you've met one person on the autism spectrum, you've just met that one person. But there's got to be an option. Well, there's an option for um, a person to really struggle with some sort of sensory issue. So, like, yeah. Um, and I would say anecdotally, for a lot of people that are on the spectrum, they probably more or less meet criteria for all four of these in this section of restricted and repetitive behaviors and patterns. We have to see, so moving on to criterion C, it's a lot. We have to see that these symptoms are present in the early developmental period. Usually we see some sort of degree of impairment as the actual thought is by the first year. But we definitely see degrees of impairment by the second year of life. But even just reduced eye contact, not laughing or smiling in the same way that other same age infants are doing, that's what's problematic. I have a good friend who has twins, and that's always really challenging because you just can't help but compare twins to one another. If one of the babies is doing this, the other baby's not doing that, then what does that mean? But a good friend of mine, her babies are almost a year, and they had a lot of stress at their house. There were a lot of things that had happened in a short period of time when the babies were like 6 months old. And she specializes in the treatment of developmental disorders, neurodevelopmental disorders. And so she essentially like assesses children and adolescents for autism spectrum disorders. And one of her sons essentially stopped making eye contact with her. And she was so, so worried that this was demonstrative of an autism spectrum disorder type presentation. And thankfully, that's not the case. And the and her son has really been able to overcome some of the difficulties. But I think he was responding to stress, but just at such a young age when babies don't have language, obviously. They still pick up on a lot, but I think he was just responding to a lot of distress that was being experienced. And so, but as far as just what we would expect to see is in the developmental um, period, we really do notice that there's a lack of interaction or lack of interest and interaction in the first year of life. And really by age 2, um, we can see more notable symptoms. When I learned this, the thinking was is that kids have normal development by the age of 2 and then they decline. And that is so interesting because that's not what the science says anymore. Um, it's just that we don't really see these more predominant social deficits because the child has not yet been at an age developmentally where these components are supposed to really come out. And so this is where we just see a shift as far as what the child that does have autism spectrum disorder or potentially has it, we just see a difference between how they are engaging with other people. And I'll say this because like 2, this is where kids are going, depending, they're going to preschool, they have daycare, they're more interactions with other children, other adults, not just the parents, not just the family. And so there's more data to be able to suggest that they're failing to meet these typical presentations, norms, expectations. as far as social emotional reciprocity. Let's see. Okay, so know that these symptoms, of course, are going to cause clinically significant impairment in more than one area of life, that they're not better explained by an overall global developmental delay or an intellectual disability, that we don't, even though we can see that there are possible co-occurring presentations as far as language skill, demonstration of language, intellectual impairments, that's not required for this diagnosis. And so we just have to make sure that, again, comprehensive testing is done to be able to identify, is this coming from a place where there are actual deficits in the brain that are creating intellectual disabilities and impairments, or is this showing up as far as emotional, social, behavioral, etc.? And I talked about the importance of identifying, or just that noting that in the past, if a person was diagnosed with Asperger's disorder, that this is where they usually did not have any sort of impairment in terms of communication. But this would just more so show up socially. We would still diagnose this person with autism spectrum disorder, but they just may not have as severe of a presentation. And so we also want to rule out that there is not a pragmatic communication disorder. So, with regard to diagnosing autism spectrum disorder, there are different specifiers that we can look to as far as really providing a nuance for a person's presentation or a child's presentation. Instead of mild, moderate, severe, or profound, we have severity levels that are either requiring very substantial support, so that's more profound, requiring substantial support, or requiring support. And so, anecdotally, this is what's known as level 3, level 2, or level 1. And so, I know that a lot of people, when their children are given a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, they will identify that it will be identified of, hey, your child has level 1 autism spectrum disorder or level 2. Level 2, anecdotally, from my understanding, really does require pretty substantial support. So this is where we might see children that are nonverbal. They really are not able to toilet themselves appropriately. Oh, that was what I was going to say earlier. Toilet themselves, they have like they get really significantly distressed and overwhelmed by any sort of changes in the environment. It's as a parent, it's dealing with a lot of emotional distress and overwhelm that the child is experiencing. I totally get this. By the way, if you think about it, like if you don't have your thinking and your reasoning, or just, like your way of being able to communicate is so impaired and people don't understand you. For children, that's hard anyways, right? For children that do not have any sort of diagnoses in this chapter, when they want something and they're trying to communicate and their mouth doesn't work because they developmentally don't have the fine motor skills or the language motor skills to be able to actually enunciate, I want this, can you get this for me? That's distressing for kids. But when you think about children, adolescents, adults that are trying to communicate or trying to do something or trying to be understood and they're not, how distressing that is, right? Like that's so overwhelming. So there's just something to be said about this. I would say that, again, profound presentation is, we are not necessarily going to see this in most of our practice. If anything, we're going to see more so anecdotally level 1. And again, this is where we would have diagnosed Asperger's in the past. But we're just going to see general difficulties as far as engaging, relating, being able to have difficulties in terms of navigating academic situations, social situations, don't have a lot of friends, that there's some degree of distress, but it may not require the child to be in a specific classroom, or it may not require a lot of layers and layers of resources of support. When children are diagnosed, fortunately, they do really get a lot of support. OT, applied behavioral analysis treatment, which is social skills treatment, managing behaviors. But it just depends on what they're diagnosed with, what degree of severity they are given at the time of diagnosis and assessment, and then what the resources are available that are indicated. Going back to the specifiers, we have the option to be able to identify whether there's an accompanying intellectual impairment or an accompanying language impairment. So that's what we want to really utilize after testing is done. If that testing has demonstrated that it's not a language impairment because of a lack of ability, there's a language impairment because of another neurological issue. And if there are known genetic medical conditions that are associated with this, environmental factors that are associated with this, if there's any other neurodevelopmental, mental, or behavioral problem, or if the person is demonstrating catatonic behaviors, catatonic presentation, that's where catatonia can show up again. So this slide is just another way to be able to break down the sections as far as the section A and then section B. So on the left-hand part of the slide, we have different wording for these deficits in social communication and interaction. So deficits in social emotional reciprocity, deficits in nonverbal communication, social interaction, and deficits in terms of really being able to develop and understand relationships enough to be able to form friendships, to be able to engage in play. I want this to go away. Here we go. To really be in the middle of the herd, more or less. And then on the right-hand side, as I showed you before, this is where I have a visual demonstration, mostly through AI, of engaging in whether that's stereotyped, like sameness and flexibility with play, how they engage in play, difficulty with regard to changing up their routines. I love this picture of the dad crying because I think that's like a very real understanding of what it's like to be a parent of a child that has neurodevelopmental disabilities or difficulties, and not knowing how to help them. And then I've talked about perseverative behaviors or sensitivity to one's sensory environment. Okay. Um, uh, I added these slides because at the time this was a really topical issue, and it still is. It's just not in the news right now. But there was a lot of media coverage around misconceptions about autism spectrum disorder and what it is versus what it isn't. What we know is that we're really getting good at being able to diagnose this. Where, I don't remember actually what the average age of diagnosis was before, like when I was in graduate school, but it wasn't the age of 2 to 4. Now there's so much more earlier intervention, earlier assessment of this. So many people, not, okay, let me put it this way. There are a handful of people that I work with who, unfortunately, their children are on the spectrum, and they have received diagnoses for their children at age 2.5, 3, age 4. And so it's not that more kids actually have this disorder. It's that we are getting better as a community in being able to understand this, to be able to refer out for comprehensive testing, and to really be able to confirm a more accurate diagnosis. I do want to say that we know for sure that autism spectrum disorder is not just caused by environmental factors, that there are certainly genetic components to this, that this is not just based on vaccines, it's not based on just other exposure to environmental toxins, like that there are strong genetic markers for the development of autism. I know people have different perspectives, but we really cannot neglect and ignore science, contrary to now popular belief. I also put this last row in because what was said before in the spring of 2025 was that those that have autism spectrum disorder will never pay taxes, they'll never write poems or go out on a date. And I really think that when RFK said that what he was talking about was intellectual developmental disabilities, and just really doesn't understand the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder because I think he was really uh, assuming that that meant issues in terms of adaptive functioning, adaptive impairments, and we just don't characteristically see this. It just depends on the person as far as autism spectrum disorder, but that's not embedded into the diagnostic criteria. So that's my thought about it. But I have a link in the presentation about this. I was surprised when I presented this to my class in the spring of 2025 that although it was very a hot button issue for my community of therapists, my students hadn't really been made aware of this. So if you're curious if this is news to you, the article is linked in the presentation. So the difference between intellectual disability versus autism spectrum disorder is we need to start with identifying are there difficulties in intellectual functioning plus adaptive impairment. So that's like the brain plus the behavior. With autism spectrum disorder, it's almost backward because the areas of clinical focus are really more so on adaptive impairment through the lens of social communication, through the lens of behaviors. And it's not necessarily what we see in intellectual disabilities. It can be there, but it doesn't have to be there. So it's possible that a child or adult that has autism spectrum disorder does have these deficits, but again, it's not required in order to be there. So this is where it's like behavior plus or minus actual deficits, impairments in the brain. So it's like uh, thinking about is it a problem with the hard drive? That's intellectual disability. And as a result, we see difficulties on the screen or we see disconnect on the screen, or is it less of a problem with the hard drive, but a software issue that shows up on the screen and it impacts the interactive features of like a touchscreen menu? I don't know if that makes sense. This is my way of being able to really synthesize this information of like, it's not one or the other. It can be both. Well, I'm trying to say is that we really have to look at what is happening that is an impairment with the brain as it shows up in a person's life versus what's happening in a person's life and are there issues with the brain? Okay, to that degree. Okay, so for communication disorders, this is where I'm really not going to spend a lot of time on this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in terms of specific learning disorders or motor disorders, but all of this is in the DSM. So know that that children, adolescents, adults can be diagnosed with, and again, we're just really focusing on children because we start to see it show up when children are continuously developing and it's impacting their functioning at school, in relationships, etc. And so, does a child have a language disorder where there's difficulties in terms of comprehension or processing? Are they having a difficulty understanding the language, not for reasons of acculturation, of moving, of being in an area where whatever language that they're speaking is not their first primary native language? And so, are there difficulties in terms of their ability to understand words, to be able to put together sentences, to be able to recognize the different use of words as it relates to the context and the situation? So, we can either have a language disorder, a speech sound disorder. So, difficulty as far as like actually thinking. Oh, pardon me. I'm sorry. How a person is able to put together. Hold on a second. I wanted to make sure this is not the same. Yeah. Put together words and enunciate really is what this is like create sound that comes out in the form of speech and be able to communicate. Childhood onset or fluency disorder, i.e. stuttering. This is what stuttering is really given the formal diagnosis of. And social pragmatic communication disorder is a child actually able to follow the correct rules of both verbal and nonverbal communication But that's the only problem that they're really having developmentally. If we're not seeing that there are social emotional reciprocity issues, it's just difficulty as far as the use of language and communication, the use of age appropriate language, the use of culturally appropriate language as it relates to back and forth communication. So, i.e., they can't follow social norms when speaking. Okay, with specific learning disorders, there are three different areas. I'm really not going to spend a lot of time on this, pardon me, but there are three different areas that we can focus on as far as being able to diagnose the particular issue as far as a person's academic skills and their academic functioning. Um, so it might be that they're having difficulty as far as being able to read clearly and effectively in a relatively normal manner of time. It might be that there's difficulty understanding what's actually being said and the meaning of this as far as what they're reading, difficulties with spelling just beyond like difficult words, difficulties as far as like how a person writes, how they are really able to connect what they want to say to how it comes out on the page, difficulties mastering numbers and mastering the sense and fluency of numbers. That's me, and difficulty with mathematical reasoning. Um, so we can diagnose as far as a specific learning disorder impairment in reading. This is what we anecdotally call dyslexia. It might be impairment in terms of written expression. So that's challenges as far as spelling accuracy, grammar, punctuation, clarity, just organization of written expression, or impairments in mathematics. So like really being able to see numbers as a language, to be able to conceptualize how to do um, math skills, math-oriented skills that are taught in academic settings, just being able to read. So this is like more anecdotally mathematic illiteracy. I'll say that depending on, again, like pardon me, what I'm trying to say is we see this in an academic setting because this is where a child is failing to meet age appropriate norms for performance. Um, as an adult, you may not know that these disorders presentations exist if you're not asking somebody to be able to write something for you, right? If a person is like not doing math for you in a day-to-day situation or they're not doing math. And so this is where it's very different. That's why we have changed the title from learning disorders to specific learning disorders because this is where they are really nuanced as far as how they show up, and they are not intellectual disabilities. They can occur alongside intellectual disabilities and warrant specific clinical attention. But this is very different than an actual difficulty globally with the brain. Not happening because of issues. These are disorders that are occurring independently, that not because of difficulties with hearing, with eyesight, not happening under the umbrella specifically of neurological issues, first language issues as far as exposure to native language, or inadequate education. So these are what we would see in like again, failing to meet culturally normal, appropriate developmental standards or settings. Um, what we would have to see in order to make a diagnosis for any of these specifiers is uh, a presence of these challenges within, that's not the word I want to use, present of these symptoms persisting for at least 6 months. And um, happening across contexts, even though this may not come out, they've affected someone substantially with regard to their academic functioning, that it's that impact is causing them to um, score. Sorry, what I'm trying to say is that this is happening below what's expected as far as their chronological age. It's causing some sort of interference academically in with their performance, and this could be showing up in terms of their activities of daily living. What I'll say is what's interesting is I had a therapist that when I was the lead of one of the programs that I used to work at, um, there was always really a big focus on documentation because there is always a big focus on documentation. Sorry, this is what's going to happen for you all. And what I would notice, like, it's very structured of, hey, we need our notes to look like this, and this. And I would have templates and I've had examples. And like, there's this one therapist that had been working in our program for a long time, not like, late stage in career life, but just like a very competent therapist. Um, I would always have difficulties with this person as far as their notes. I'd be like, hey, we need to do 3 sentences. The first sentence needs to say something along these lines. This is the second sentence is this, and the third sentence is like this. And I just know for context that like that's really kind of the minimum that I used to say. People could write more if they wanted to, but like these were the basics of what our documentation standards would look like. This therapist would give me like 2 sentences or wouldn't it, I'd be like, I don't understand what what's happening here versus what I know happened in the session. And at one point, the therapist was like, I have dyslexia. Like, oh my gosh, that would have been really helpful for me to understand, even though everybody has the right to privacy. Like, but that's context that's missing. Because once I learned that, then it's like that makes so much more sense why this is a really difficult area for you as far as this work. And so we just had different accommodations that we would make and different expectations of what that was supposed to look like. But I had no idea, and I would never have known that. This therapist had no issue as far as speech, as far as social emotional reasoning, flexible, like um, communication. Like there were no overt issues until I started looking at their documentation. And I've had other therapists over the years that it's like, so there's a processing issue that's here because what I'm telling you versus what's coming out on the page and what you have examples of, it's challenging for some people to even like copy those examples. And so that's where I look to specific learning disorders as a possible conceptual understanding. Does not mean that I'm like formally giving anybody a diagnosis, but when I'm like, this doesn't match, there's something else that's happening. That's what I could look to. That's what we could look to. Okay, so we also do have the presence of motor disorders, so developmental coordination disorders. So these are children that are clumsy. They have difficulties with their fine and motor, oh, sorry, fine and gross motor skills. Um, and uh, so these are children that would have difficulty riding a bike, catching a ball, not tripping, walking in a straight line. So not meeting criteria, not meeting developmental expectations for movement and for, yeah, coordination. Stereotypic movement disorder, this is what we would see in criteria B1 for autism spectrum disorder. But if that child is only demonstrating this particular type of repetitive, driven, like stimming behavior, we're not seeing the other issues, and that's where we would go to this diagnosis instead of autism spectrum disorder. It's possible that a person has a tic disorder. So this is sudden, I mean, I think we know what tics are, but sudden, rapid, recurrent, non-voluntary movement or vocalization. Tourette's, this is a more advanced presentation of a tic disorder as far as a vocal tic. Um, and then persistent chronic motor volt. This is totally out of my range of competence. Know that this is there. Uh, if you need to diagnose any of these, this is where we need a person that is trained in this, skilled in this. It's not me. Okay, so let's see. I don't worry about this. This is not on our exam, but just know that it's there. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears to ADHD. I know this very well. What we're going to see in ADHD is while this is a neurodevelopmental disorder, we are going to see impairments as far as inattention, managing one's behavior, being able to actually be consistent, organized, um, to be able to stay on task, to focus. So the two primary areas of impairment are going to be either in attention or hyperactivity and impulsivity. So we used to have the terms be ADD versus ADHD. then it got elevated to ADHD, and now we have specifiers or subtypes, pardon me, that we look to as far as being able to better understand what a person is struggling with. Um, we need to see six or more symptoms in order to meet criteria for either of these presentations, pardon me. And so we're either going to see inattention and or hyperactivity or impulsivity. So we can have one, the other, or a combined type. So inattention, this is where we're, anecdotally going to see this in a more covert way. And often it's thought that those that have ADHD that are predominantly inattentive are females, and those that have predominantly hyperactive or impulsive presentations are males. There's just a different that can be the case, but there's also just a different demonstration based on gender norms as well. And so it doesn't mean that this can't be the case that boys can't have primarily inattentive symptoms or girls can't be primarily hyperactive. 'Cause my roommate in college, my sophomore year, whew, very, very hyperactive and inattentive, like just ADHD across the board. Um, so with regard to inattention, as I said, we need to see six or more symptoms that need to be demonstrated over a course of 6 or more months. And they're going to show up across contexts. It's not just at home, not just at school, not just in a social situation. Like we really do need to see there be more of an overarching presentation, even though before we used to have like a minimum requirement, and now it's like we just need to see what, sorry, now, just kidding. We need to see this present or more in two settings. It used to be across all contexts, and now it's two or more settings. So I think I should just start with this slide. Sometimes this can get overwhelming as far as all of the symptomatic criteria. So these specifiers, as I said, we could have combined, predominantly inattentive or predominantly hyperactive impulsive. For criteria to be met in children under 17, that's what we need to see. At least 5 symptoms need to be met for those that are over 17. So, but what we also really need to know is that these symptoms have been present prior to the age of 12. It used to be 7. They've changed it to 12. It's just is what it is. I still think that we see these from an earlier age. But with regard to the inattentive symptoms, it might be that the difficulty with attention, with like attention to detail, and that does not mean that's across the board. I would say anecdotally that when it's information that really matters, like that's where there can be a hyper focus on attention. So I have ADHD, and I have more of an inattentive type. But if we're talking about like details that matter, I am the one to catch spelling errors. I'm the one to catch grammatical mistakes. I used to work for a construction company, and for one week, my job was to go into this house that we had newly built and to find all of the spots on the wall that needed a touch up of paint. When my husband and I launched our Airbnb, I did that for 2 weeks because we hired a painter that was not great. So I had to go touch up the walls. I did this during COVID. So I would like have like phone sessions with my clients in my private practice while I was painting our house. And it was like the best ever. I can still very vividly remember a lot of my sessions because I was so hyper attuned and focused in these types of situations, but it really has to be something that matters to the person that they really have an interest in anyways. For things that are not interesting, then that is where we might see careless mistakes, not being able to actually home in on the details. Certainly difficulty in terms of sustaining attention and being able in tasks, activities, that's, in an academic setting, in conversations, not listening when being spoken to directly, not following through on instructions, or failing to finish schoolwork, chores, duties in the workplace. This can really also be like anecdotally procrastination, because of the amount of energy that it takes to be able to like muster attention and to put that focus into a task that one does not want to do. Difficulties connecting those instructions with the task itself, not follow, and I'm looking at symptom E, difficulty organizing, sequencing, being able to keep track of things, keep belongings in order. So this is where we see people like, with disorganized work, time management, not really being able to sequence. Hey, if this is me to a T because I'm like, oh, this should take me 3 hours, or this should take me 30 minutes to do, and then it takes 3 hours. Just not having the same kind of like tangible concept of time that other people do. That's why I'm always late. Sorry. Just like maximizing my time and not really being able to have like a fluid understanding of what time actually really is. Um, and then the other thing I was going to say is like not being able to keep track of things. So if you know anybody that has ADHD that loses stuff, like this is where this falls into the difficulty with organizing tasks, activities, like not being able to keep track of that because they're like not actually remembering where that is based on being so distracted. Um, Often avoids, dislikes, or is reluctant to engage in tasks that require sustained mental effort. So that's what I was talking about, the procrastination. Because like, oh my gosh, like I have no idea how long this is gonna take. I have no idea like what this is gonna be like. I have no interest in this. I don't want to do it. I don't want to do it. When I was studying for my licensure exam, my house was so clean because I did not want to study. Like it's so the first couple months, I just had like a really clean house, and then I realized you can't try to study at home. Like you have to study outside of home. And then it was a lot easier. I would go to the library and I would study after work for a few hours, and like there was nothing for me to clean. I just had to do it. But that took a lot of prep and like a lot of coaching for myself to be able to do that. And then loses things necessary for tasks or activities. I know I said this in the difficulty organizing, but they really kind of go hand in hand. Like if I'm having a hard time, like being able to keep things in order and staying focused during this process, like I might lose things too. But this is its own separate type of symptom as well. Being distracted by extraneous stimuli, forgetful in daily activities, like all of these really do fit into one another. It's just a matter of how they specifically show up for a person. With regard to hyperactivity or impulsivity, this is where we can see that, again, we need to see 6 months. That's inconsistent with the developmental level. It's not just a manifestation of oppositional behavior, defiance, hostility. So this is not just like, happening because one is intending or like in control of this. So this is where we're directly ruling out ODD, even though these can be comorbid. This is where we see children, adolescents, adults that can't sit still. They're fidgeting, they're tapping their hands. Before I was given medication, I will tell the story in class, but I would always tap my foot. I would always like shake my foot, and my friends would make fun of me of this. And I'm like, I don't know where this comes from or why I'm doing this, but like I can't sit still. Moreover, we see children that have difficulty sitting and staying in their seat when they're expected. They get up, they move around, not having the ability to manage their desire to run or climb in situations where it's not appropriate, having difficulty in engaging in tasks quietly, often on the go as driven by a motor, not being able to manage the impulse to talk. So this is talking excessively, blurts out an answer before a question has been completed. Just thinking of elementary school. I always got in trouble for talking. Always got in trouble for talking. I just could not keep it in. So difficulty waiting his or her turn, often interrupts or intrudes on others, so butts into conversations without being able to be like, hey, I need to wait. Or like maybe that's the case, but not being able to manage that impulse. This is why I have this diagnosis here as a connective thread, because these are impulse control issues on this particular subtype, impulse control issues. Um, Inattention is a little bit different, but that's where we definitely see is like that disconnect between thought and action. So we know that this can impact a person's functioning. It's not happening as the form of a thought disorder. Um, Again, is where testing is really required. There are specifiers, mild, moderate, or severe. Um, and it's like some we can identify fit that there are mild impairments in person's social or occupational adaptive functioning, but I would say that like a lot of times that people have ADHD, they it's really challenging. It's very challenging socially, it's challenging academically. This is where intelligence can be super helpful, but it also can be really masking because a person's intelligence might allow them to continue to like, take in information and process it, but they can't execute it as far as performance. They can't execute it as far as testing because they can't sit still, they can't focus. So it just really depends. When I was given a diagnosis finally, my the psychologist that did my testing was like, "You're literally off the charts. Like it's literally like in this such a small end of the spectrum that rarely few people meet." I don't know if he was just saying this to make me feel better or what, but yeah, that was a long time coming to get diagnosed. Um, okay, so associated features with ADHD, I have all these rule outs, these comorbidities. I'll talk about this in class of like, what we typically, ADHD can be something, there's a lot that I want to say that I'm going to actually address in class, but ADHD can be something that causes distress because of the presence of it, or looks like difficulties in managing attention, managing one's impulses that are really from a different disorder. So, from anxiety disorder, from major depressive disorder, from PTSD, that's a huge one, from alerting disorder. And so that's where the comprehensive testing really goes into this. But those aspects can also be comorbid too, because they can result in the development of these other disorders as a result of having this disorder and the effect that it causes as far as a person's academic performance, their ability to relate socially, to connect with other people, to be able to function in a job. Like there's just a lot of ways that this can come out. Okay, so here's another demonstration or another slide for you as far as remembering and being able to, um, if I were to tell you on a final different examples, wink, hint, hint, wink, wink, if I were to tell you on a final different examples of a child's behavior, this is a slide to be able to help remember if it's inattentive or hyperactive. So I just really broke down the symptoms from the actual disorder. So here are treatment options up to this point. Applied behavioral analysis, method, parent management training. There's a lot of different ones that the textbook talks about. These are all really helpful as far as like evidence-based training, educational directive type therapies to help a person adjust, to cope, to be able to, and I'm not trying to put all of these like under one category because like ABA is really what we see for autism spectrum disorder. For instance, parent management training is what we can see for a child that has autism spectrum disorder or ADHD. It's really a matter of like what the child needs, where they are in terms of their experience with their disorder, and what resources are available. But what we are really trying to focus on is how do we help the child? How do we give the child skills and tools? How can we implement awareness and help the child with their functioning? And how can we do the same for the parents too, for the caregivers? How do we really support those that are supporting the child? A lot of times, having an IEP, an individualized education plan, a 504 plan at school, the 504 plan is a starting point for ADHD. Doesn't necessarily mean that there are overall difficulties that a child is having in an academic setting that require a comprehensive change in terms of their their needs, accommodations, etc. It might look like the 504 plan is like they might need more time for tests. They might need to be able to take a test in a more quiet environment. Those are really like common accommodations that are made. An IEP is a much more comprehensive process. The 504 plan will follow a person through college, and the IEP does not. So this is where it's a reminder that we need to start with a rigorous, multi-part, multi-day, multi-environment assessment for all of these diagnoses. Um, okay, so I'm going to switch gears to impulse control, disruptive behavior, conduct disorders. And like I said, I put those together because having difficulties managing one's impulses can show up as it relates to a child. Where did this come from? A child or an adult's um, behaviors, how they demonstrate their emotions. And so, what the DSM talks about is that with intermittent explosive disorder, oppositional defiant disorder versus conduct disorder, that on one hand, this is the different order in the DSM, but on one hand, oh, pardon me, that all three of these disorders come down to themes of self-control, either in emotional, behavioral, and or both types of regulation. So, and what the DSM says is that like the personality types, is that what it says? Yeah, personality dimensions fall under disinhibition or negative emotionality. So with inversely with constraint and agreeableness. So like what we are not seeing is a person's ability to be um, constraining and restrictive of their behaviors under the umbrella of any of these disorders. Instead, we're seeing difficulties in terms of managing one's reactivity, managing one's behaviors, caring about how either of those really affects other people, and or managing one's emotionality. So this is my way of trying to say that intermittent explosive disorder really goes on one end of the spectrum as far as emotion regulation problems. So intermittent explosive disorder is a difficulty in terms of regulating one's emotions and this really coming out in an explosive way. Oppositional defiant disorder is somewhere in the middle. I think it's more so in terms of emotion regulation. Well, no. Oh, that's what it is. I say it's right in the middle. Intermittent explosive disorder still has some nuances as far as behavior regulation, but that conceptually comes from difficulties managing one's emotion. Because the reality of this is that, like, when we have challenges managing our emotions, there is a connection between what we're feeling and how this comes out, right? Like, most of us just like don't, if we're upset about something, we're angry, we're overwhelmed, we don't just like sit there silently and be like, this is hard. Right? It's there's some sort of externalization of this. And so that's where I moved intermittent explosive disorder a little bit over, even though the DSM says that it's really like under that umbrella of emotion regulation problems. ODD, somewhere in the middle. Oppositional defiant disorder, like it's both. Challenges managing one's emotions and their behaviors. And conduct disorder is far less about an emotion regulation problem and much more about a regulation problem. This is where I taking this from the DSM that it's like these behaviors and the inability to actually regulate one's behaviors coming from their thoughts impact a person as far as their aggression, destruction of property, and it ultimately violates the rights and norms of other people. So what is an impulse? This is a strong and sudden, unreflective, so I'm not thinking about it, I'm just doing it, desire to act. In other words, it's a tendency to act without thinking. I said earlier, it's a disconnect between thought and action. So sometimes we act first and then we deal with the consequences later. This can certainly shape our impulses and whether we decide to act on them in the future. With impulse control disorders, the consequences are not naturally deterrents for shaping one's behavior. So this comes from, I don't know if you'll find this funny, an anecdote between my best friend and myself, who also has ADHD, where we were at a restaurant and there was this gigantic vase on this counter in the middle of the restaurant. And it was at a busy restaurant where there was like a counter situation, but then you would go sit in the dining room afterward. Um, and so while we were standing kind of in the middle of this restaurant looking over at everybody, my friend said to me, "What would it be like if I pushed this vase over right now?" We thought it was the funniest thing ever because like that was really demonstrative of what happens in our minds of like picturing it. Again, this is where I don't know if this is funny to anybody or not, but myself, I know it was like I had to be there type of a situation. Obviously, we didn't do it. We had the ability to manage our emotions, or pardon me, to manage our impulses. But this is like an example of I'm just going to do this because I think I want to do it or I feel like I want to do it versus if I push this over, everybody, what we said was like, if we push this over, everybody's going to stop. They're going to look at us. We're going to get kicked out of the restaurant. We're going to have to pay for it. Again, it was not a desire that we actually had to do it. Um, but if we acted on that impulse, that would be problematic. For those that are able to manage their impulses, more or less, they have the ability to play the tape forward. If I do this, then this is going to happen. In impulse control disorders, that type of thought process, that process checking isn't there in the same way. So let me get into this. So understanding impulse control issues, this is where on the left-hand side, a brain without impulse control issues. We are humans, like we have desires for things that make us feel good. With time, with development, with maturity, with experiences, we learn from making mistakes, right? And so when we're children, we don't have that global context and whether it's based on our intellectual capabilities or through shaped behavior, through conditioned behavior, we're able to get to a point where it's like, hey, if I do this, then this is going to happen, right? I want to do this, but I can't because this is going to happen and I don't want to deal with the consequences. So I have this craving for this. I have this desire to say this. I really would love to pick up the phone and call this person, but if I do this, then this is going to be problematic. So I'm not going to do that. But in the absence of actually following through with impulse, this is where we get rewarded. If it's delayed gratification, if I have this craving where I just like go home and I really want to eat ice cream, but I can't because I'm going to eat the whole pint, and that's not going to be good for me because if I did that every single night, then I would probably put myself at risk for diabetes type 2. The delayed gratification is like, this is a weird example. The delayed gratification is like, wow, that's really great because I can sit through an impulse. Like I can manage a craving. I can actually overcome that discomfort that comes from like what my brain is telling me it wants to do to be able to self-soothe. And then it's like we remember that. That's the idea of managing our impulses. Or I don't know. Think about an example of what it's like when you didn't say something even though you wanted to, or that you didn't do something, you didn't act on an impulse despite wanting to. We want to practice pushing that out as best as possible. Usually the reward comes from the lack of consequence, but it also comes from like if I wait, I mean, this is like the marshmallow experiment. When children were told, here, you can have one marshmallow right now. If you wait, you're going to get two. For kids, and they've done a lot of debunking of this whole experiment. But for kids that had difficulties in some areas, they were not able to wait. And so they had the immediate gratification. They did not get to experience the delayed gratification that came from waiting for another one. So brains with impulse control issues, this is where we still have impulses, but that, hey, wait, if I do this, then what? Factor isn't there in the same way. It's not it's acting based on the thought, based on the feeling, acting on that impulse. And then there's dopamine that still is released for engaging in that behavior, right? Like eating that marshmallow is still going to actually release dopamine. But it's just a question of the consequence, who the person is, what the situation is, and what the consequences are. Are they severe enough to shape behavior? So this is where a person gets conditioned to essentially connect with the feeling rather than the thought. So I hope that that's helpful. When we talk about oppositional defiant disorder, again, this is in the middle of the spectrum. I want you to think about this as far as like poorly controlled behaviors and emotions. This is going to be a pattern of angry, irritable mood, argumentative or defiant behavior, or vindictiveness that lasts at least 6 months. And it's evidenced by four symptoms from any of these categories in the diagnosis. So we are typically, I mean, we can diagnose children under the age of 5. This is where I just think it becomes challenging because, again, what's developmental and what's the environment, and how does that continue to really change based on age and based on the shifts in the environment? So, more commonly, like we're just going to see this show up in children of an elementary age, but then also I just think anecdotally, like in an adolescent type of presentation, because that's where there's a little bit more of the ability to either think things through, or there's a nuance as far as how this shows up with relationships, how this shows up in terms of reaction to authority. So it just depends. But we would see that a person is having difficulty managing their anger. So they might lose their temper often. They might be easily annoyed or resentful. I would say that the easily annoyed is anecdotally a common one. It's like person is like more readily irritable, that comes out more often. The argumentative and defiant behavior, this is like hallmark ODD. So often argues with authority figures, with children, with adolescents, with adults, but like really this is where we're going to see that boy in the back of the classroom that is making fun of the teacher behind their back, or in the teacher's like, hey, I need you to pay attention. That student is going to be deliberately provoking for to the teacher or to other classmates. They might actively refuse to comply with the rules. Hey, I told you this is the third time. If you don't do this, I got to kick you out of the class. Well, I don't care. I'm going to do this. I don't. It's hard for me to say this without cursing. Um, I don't care. Screw you. Whatever. Not thinking of the consequences, right? Not being impacted by the consequences. Deliberately annoying others. Again, that's where I see that connection between being easily annoyed and deliberately annoying others. Often blaming others for their mistakes or behaviors. And this is what I think anecdotally is really difficult as far as treating ODD is it's not, we don't have the same kind of reflection and the same kind of connection to responsibility and ownership. And so it's really hard to work with a teenager that has ODD if they don't really care. If they're like, oh, yeah, I guess I should stop doing this. So I stop myself from getting grounded or stop myself from like getting suspended. It might be like that, I didn't do this because it was me. I did this because somebody else told me to. It's less about that. I did this because this person was really upsetting me. This person was really pissing me off. They deserved it. There's a reason why I yelled at the teacher is because he said this to me instead, or he like wasn't. I don't know. I'm not making good examples right now. Um, there is a displacement of responsibility. Also, this person might have been spiteful or vindictive twice in the last 6 months. So that is calculating that, like, I'm doing this to get back at this person, or I'm planning this out of how I'm going to impact this person. But we don't see this happening regularly. It's just that if this is an example that we can use to diagnosis, that this has happened in a couple of times in the past 6 months. And so we have to see how this is showing up as far as frequency, intensity, persistence, duration. So for children younger than 5, this behavior should occur most days for a period of at least 6 months. Individuals 5 or older, the behavior should occur at least once a week for at least 6 months. Um, so this is not happening in the same way that disruptive mood dysregulation disorder is occurring. So, if what we remember from disruptive mood dysregulation disorder is that this is happening within a year, at least a year's worth of time, and there are frequent demonstrations of very angry, reactive outbursts, anger outbursts. In the absence of that, irritability, right? Remember this? This is where for children that are older than 5, this is not necessarily occurring to this degree every single day. But I will say that it does happen often, but it just is not required within the diagnosis. And what is interesting is this, it says on criterion B that the disturbance is associated with distress in the individuals or others in the person's immediate social context. So it's not causing them distress, it's causing the people that are around them distress. And it's going to impact them in terms of social situations, right? If people don't like them and they don't want to be around them because they're deliberately annoying others, they're not going to have a lot of friends, or their friends are going to be the same, where they just annoy one another, they make fun of one another. Obviously, it could be impacting a person as far as their academic functioning, their work performance, other environments. And it's not occurring during the course of either substance use, a psychotic presentation, or depressive bipolar disorder. So, and it's also not meeting criteria for disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. So, this is where we can diagnose severity based on the settings. So, if it's mild, 1 setting, moderate, 2, severe, 3 or more settings. I always worked with the teenagers that it was at least moderate, and I just tried my best to be able to have treatment with them where they weren't deliberately annoying me, but that just depended on the person. So we have these 3 areas. So remember, angry, irritable mood, argumentative, defiant behavior, right? And vindictiveness, like spitefulness, vindictiveness. So um, that's not an emotional reaction. That is really a behavioral problem. So that's where it meets in the middle of the spectrum. Intermittent explosive disorder. So again, not necessarily behavioral problems, but the emotions can come out in the behavior. So this is where we're going to see recurrent behavioral outbursts, a failure to be able to control aggressive emotional impulses. So whether that's verbal aggression, whether a person is throwing temper tantrums, they're on these like anger tirades, they're like getting into like verbal arguments or fights, or physical aggression toward property, animals, or other individuals. This is happening twice weekly on an average of 3 months. It does not result in damage or destruction of property and does not result in physical injury to animals or individuals. So we can have that as a marker for the diagnosis, or we can see, it says either of the following, or we can see that there are 3 behavioral outbursts within a 12-month period of time where this person has demonstrated damage to or destruction of property or physical assault that has resulted in physical injury against animals or other people in a 12-month period of time. So it's kind of like, if you are having difficult, if you have a bad year and you get in a fight with somebody in the parking lot and then you punch them, and that happens 2 other times in that year, then that's enough to be able to actually identify intermittent explosive disorder. The magnitude of this aggression is really grossly out of proportion to the nature of the situation or how that person was provoked or what the precipitating factors were. It's not premeditated, so it's not like I was like really thinking about how I was going to go up to some, not me, but thinking about how I was going to go up to somebody and punch them in the parking lot. There's not some sort of like calculation. It is like emotional reactivity, emotional regulation problems. This is why we call it an impulse control issue. Um, and there's not any sort of secondary gain in that process. But it also, this can cause marked distress in the person, or impairment in their functioning, but it also can be associated with financial legal consequences, right? Um, and I would say that this can result in distress in other people too, but it's think about it in the way that it's these, there's some sort of insinuation of a baseline here, but problems being able to manage a person's response to their emotions in the moment. And so this is where it really focuses on the distress happening to the person, not to the people around them, like we saw in oppositional defiant disorder. The person has to be at least 6 years in order for us to be able to diagnose this. We have all of these rule outs. I mean, it's specifically, again, like the mood disorders, disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, antisocial personality disorder. That is what we would want to rule out too. This can be made in addition to ADHD, can be made in addition to conduct disorder. This is where it gets kind of sticky because where it's ruling out antisocial personality disorder, but we can see that it's happening in conduct disorder or ODD. I'll talk about this in a minute. Um, but it's much more, oh, yeah. And it could happen in the context of autism spectrum disorder, but it's really where we want to focus independent clinical attention on these types of outbursts. So conduct disorder, this is again poorly controlled behavior, but not poorly controlled emotions. So this is where it becomes a lot more complex, especially when you think about it in comparison to oppositional defiant disorder. So again, oppositional defiant disorder is we have like the anger, irritable mood, defiant behavior. So we still can see aggression, but that's different than losing one's temper or being easily annoyed or angry and resentful. Um, so this is where we see aggression to people and animals, animals, and that's anger versus aggression that I mean that I'm am highlighting. So, and bullying, threatening people, intimidating others, initiating physical fights, using weapons, physically cruel to people, physically cruel to animals that they've stolen from people, forced someone into sexual activities. Like this is not just anger. These are more deliberate acts that are aggressive, that violate the rights and norms of people. Going back to the overarching explanation of this is what I say. They violate the basic rights of other people. They violate the societal norms. Um, we need to see at least three of these criteria in the past 12 months for at least 6 months. But I'm going to tell you that usually there are more than just three. So there's aggression to people and animals, destruction of property. So that's fire setting, destroyed others' property. So graffiti, breaking windows, you know, causing damage to cars, theft, deceitfulness or theft. So they've broken into somebody's house or somebody's car. They've lied, conning others. That's an example of what that can look like. They've stolen items without actually confronting. So that's like shoplifting, robbery, forgery, um, serious violation of the rules, staying out at night despite the rules, beginning at the age of 13. Maybe they've run away from home at least twice while living in in parents' home. Often truant from school. So we see behavioral issues in this regard before, well, let's see, before the age of 13. So not just at the age of 13, before the age of 13. This is causing clinically significant impairment, not distress, impairment in their social, academic, or occupational functioning. And if they are 18 years or older, then they're not meeting criteria for antisocial personality disorder. So I'm going to talk about this. Um, but but usually that's where we shift to that diagnosis instead. So, what was I going to say about this? Oh, I can't remember. This is much more nuanced. This is much more elevated and progressive as far as, again, when we think about ODD is that teenager in the back of the classroom that is making fun of the teacher or is really trying to get under somebody's skin. This is what I was going to say. Conduct disorder is like there is a cruelty and aggression that is not coming from emotional reactivity. This is like, I'm going to do what I want. I'm going to get what I want, and I don't care how it affects a person. I was reading a book a couple months ago where one of the main characters had conduct disorder. He was like 16 years old. And he was in love with another character, and she was in boarding school. And so this teenage boy came essentially to visit her at boarding school. Well, this teenage girl who didn't necessarily want to be there, wanted to run away, and she knew that this guy that she liked would essentially like aid in that process. And so what I thought was interesting as far as like impulse control, like not, thinking ahead, that the she had said, let's go. And he was like, okay, let's go. It wasn't like, well, no, you should really stay. It's important for you to be in school. I dropped out. This is what happened in the story. I dropped out, and look where that got me. Like none of that. I was like, yeah, let's go. Let's piss people off and let's go. I know that this actually doesn't fit into the criteria of what we're seeing here, but it also leads into the criteria of antisocial personality disorder, which this character really, in the later stages of the book, it was clear that they had that. But I saw markers of this as far as like conning behaviors, being dishonest with people in order to get what they wanted, doing one thing and then saying one thing and then doing another, cruelty to people. In this book, the female character was like the only person that the male character with chronic disorder actually cared for. Had no friends, had no real relationships, like really was just flying by the seat of his pants and was narrowly escaping a lot of consequences. So with conduct disorder, we can have a bunch of different types of specifiers. So whether there's a focus on limited prosocial emotions, so like this is where it's like a marker for really not having a lot of empathy, a lot of being able to engage in relationships or yeah, like engage in emotional, reflective, reciprocative functioning. Um, whether that's let's see. Is that the same? Did I just copy that? Oh, interesting. It might be a lack of remorse or guilt, so they really don't feel guilty when they're doing anything bad or wrong. I would say that that's kind of a predominant factor anyways in this, but if we need to specify it, we can. And they might be that there's a significant notable lack of empathy, so not just unable to actually engage in emotional functioning, but really cold, uncaring, not at all concerned of the emotions, thoughts, feelings of other people, even when they're engaging in substantial harm. That's really problematic. Unconcerned about consequences, their performance, it's essentially like participation in societal norms, or shallow or deficient affect. Superficial, they can turn emotions on or off, insincere. Like these are all markers for antisocial personality disorder. So remember this guy. This is where I've commonly been asked, well, what's the difference between conduct disorder? Why is this such a big, nuanced diagnosis versus antisocial personality disorder? Now, what we know is that with conduct disorder, the adolescent needs to demonstrate two of the 15 symptoms for a period of 12 months. In antisocial personality disorder, these conduct disorder related behaviors need to be present since the age of 15, and then we can diagnose antisocial personality disorder after the age of 15. But they have to have been diagnosed with conduct disorder first in order for us to be able to actually um, confirm antisocial personality disorder after the age of 18. Going back to these symptoms of antisocial personality disorder, these are really like I have this The first one is really an overarching description of conduct disorder, the failure to conform to social norms with respect to lawful behaviors, that they're doing things that are consistently violating the rights and norms of others. And deceitfulness, this is more of an overarching presentation that we can see in terms of antisocial personality disorder, that impulsivity or failure to plan ahead. That's like when the girl was like, I want to get out of here. And he's like, let's go. No sense of where are we going to stay? How are we going to have any money to live? I mean, these were in this book, teenagers that were like just like found a hotel. This is, going on a tangent, but it was no thinking ahead of, oh, if we do this, then what? How are we going to be able to actually make this happen? Let alone what kind of consequences are you going to have to deal with? I will explain this better if you want to know more about that particular story. Anyways, we see a combination of irritability and aggression showing up in physical fights or assaults, a disregard of safety for others. Again, it's a culmination of conduct disorder criteria, consistent irresponsibility, really not able to perform as an adult in the world. It's graduation from a serious violation of rules and a lack of remorse, being indifferent to be able to like or being indifferent to hurting somebody and the effect that that has. So this is where we see in antisocial personality disorder this combination of these specifiers in conduct disorder. I hope that that makes sense, but just know that this is the progression. It has to be the progression because this is what's indicated in antisocial personality disorder. But this is where it shows up first in an adolescent's life before we can actually diagnose it as antisocial personality disorder. Okay, so the other impulse control disorders that we have are pyromania and kleptomania. Know that there are similarities to obsessive compulsive disorders, and there are differences. So remember, in obsessive compulsive disorders of trichotillomania and excoriation, we had the antecedent, the emotion, tension in terms of what happens after that emotion, and then engagement in that behavior of I feel anxious, I feel overwhelmed, I really want to pull on my hair, but I know I shouldn't. But there's tension until I do it. And when I do it, I feel immediate relief, but then I feel out of control. Then I feel embarrassed and I'm ashamed of myself. Let's compare that to this impulse control cycle of there still is tension. There's some sort of affective arousal of like, I want to do this. I want to do this. Then there's the demonstration of the behavior. So I want to steal this. I want to set this on fire. I have to do this. I have to do this. It's like scratching that itch. And then there's pleasure gratification at the time of the behavior. What we don't see is the experience of the consequence. So, experience of the shame, of the embarrassment. So, there's deliberate, for pyromania, this deliberate, purposeful fire setting on more than one occasion, that tension or affective arousal before it happens, the fascination in fire, and then the pleasure, the reward after engaging in that process. But it's not done for any sort of political reasons, like to send a message. It's like just this cycle of, I want to do this. I really need to do this. I need to do this. I need to do this. That feels good. We don't see this fitting under cognitive, pardon me, under conduct disorder. It can happen, but in conduct disorder, we need to see more symptoms. Then kleptomania, this is the recurrent engagement in stealing something based on the impulse to be able to do that. So again, that increasing sense of tension before committing the theft, and then the pleasure, the relief, the gratification at the time of doing it. It's not done again to send a message, not better explained by conduct disorder. So this is just a reminder of the rule outs. Okay, that is it for us in this presentation. Hey, y'all, thank you for getting through this. I'm really sorry. My brain is totally fried. I hope this has been helpful. But yeah, okay, thanks. Bye.